All right, this is our presentation on Wieland, or The Transformation, written in 1798 by Charles Brockden Brown.
Characters of Wieland. Clara Wieland. She's the narrator of the novel. She's a sister to Theodore Wieland. She pines for characters of Wieland. Clara Wieland. She's the narrator of the novel, sister to Theodore Wieland, pines for Henry throughout the book. Is she a reliable narrator? Questions remain. Henry is a family friend. He's well-traveled, been to Europe, well-educated. Theodore Wieland succumbs to a psychotic break episode, kills his family because voices tell him to. Catherine Wieland, family friend to Clara, marries Theodore, falls victim to her husband's madness as she is murdered along with her children. Carwin, lonesome stranger, befriends the household, mysterious background. He's able to throw his voice, the talent of ventriloquism. He can be heard anywhere and change his voice to disguise as anyone's. Is he the villain? Is he just playing games? How culpable is he in this novel?
The plot of Wieland. Clara and Theodore Wieland live an idyllic life on their family estate in rural America with the Pleyel siblings. Theodore is married to Catherine Pleyel, and Clara is in love with Henry Pleyel. The Wieland's father, a German immigrant who came to America to spread his new religion, died under mysterious circumstances in Clara's infancy. And in the way the book describes it, it's very similar to like a spontaneous human combustion, which is like a very interesting to see this in like a novel from the 1700s, but unfortunately it's like never directly touched upon like ever again in the story. So it's still shrouded in mystery. Their life is thrown into sudden turmoil with the arrival of the enigmatic Carwin, as well as several experiences where Clara, Theodore, and Henry hear the disembodied voices of their friends and family. These voices end up ruining Clara's friendship with Henry, and she suspects Carwin is responsible. These events reach a climax when Theodore Wieland murders his wife and children after claiming to hear God commanding him to do so. Clara confronts Carwin, and he confirms her suspicions, revealing that he has the powers of bililoquism, which is basically a word for ventriloquism. I don't know if this was the term for ventriloquism in like the 18th century, or if this is something that Charles Brockden Brown invented, but basically the same thing. It allows him to, which allow him to perfectly impersonate and throw his own voice, though he claims that he never told Theodore to kill his family. Theodore suddenly breaks out of prison and corners Clara in her home. She is the next person God has commanded him to kill. Carwin uses his powers to save Clara. Theodore, realizing his insanity, kills himself in despair. This leaves off on like a very, stressful, horrific note, but then the final chapter describes how Clara travels to Europe and marries Pleyel, and they live like happily ever after, basically, in like this very nice house, while Carwin just goes on to live an innocuous life as a farmer in some unspecified location in the colonies. I think it might be Pennsylvania or something, I don't know. But next, how is Wieland indebted to Gothic literature? Gothic literature begins in England in 1764 with the publication of Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. This novel created many of the tropes we associate with Gothic novels: family bloodlines, sublime and supernatural occurrences, gloomy settings, framed narratives, and melodramatic writing. And The Castle of Otranto is basically this horror story. There's like a little image here in the bottom right. This is the first scene in the book. It's like the main villain is this king, and his son gets killed like right before his wedding by like this giant helmet that falls from the sky. It's followed by all this like spooky stuff that happens later. I think there's like talking paintings and moving knights of armor. But it basically like created all these like ghost story cliches that we associate with like Scooby-Doo and horror movies and stuff. And being the first American Gothic novel, Brown undoubtedly took inspiration from The Castle of Otranto and the other Gothic novels published after its release. I forgot the exact names and authors of like these novels, but that there were a few between Otranto and Wieland that were pretty important. And this is most evident in Wieland's melodramatic and spooky style, supernatural events, and themes of family. How did Wieland influence future Gothic writers? Brown's novel, despite taking lots of inspiration from previous Gothic works, also delineated considerably from its predecessors. Significantly, Wieland marks a shift in Gothic literature towards the psychological, as seen with the mental torment suffered by Theodore. In a way, focus is shifted away from the supernatural elements of Gothic literature and onto the thoughts and fears of its characters. Now, this isn't like a sea change in Gothic literature. I mean, it still adheres like very specifically to the formula, like the Otranto formula, but you do get to see, the supernatural stuff is still like important, but like the thoughts like, oh my god, this is so scary, oh, this is like tormenting me, that's getting like more in the limelight. Whereas like Otranto, it was just like, oh my god, that was scary. It's not like really getting into like the characters' thoughts and their fears and stuff. And Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, considered by many to be the quintessential Gothic novel of the 19th century, is published roughly 20 years after Wieland. Shelley and her romantic peers were all readers of Charles Brockden Brown. In Frankenstein, Shelley borrows some of the ideas that were sprouting in Wieland and takes them to a whole new level. So, I mean, if you've ever read Frankenstein, it's like this very crazy novel. It's got like the Gothic stuff, and I don't know, I guess it wouldn't be supernatural. I mean, it explains like the whole, the monster was like created by science, and you've got this like big conflict between like nature and mankind and like playing God and all that. And it's like a very big step from Wieland, but some of the ideas, Shelley probably took a few notes from the Wieland playbook, and future American horror writers like Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft were also indebted to Wieland and the rest of Brown's work.
A discussion of the role of religion and how it plays into Brown's work. So, Clara's whole family before her have been conflicted with religion, but in this book it demonstrates the choice to practice religion or not in the nation. For instance, how Clara respected religion, but her life was not based around it, and she did not have to live by the rules of the church. They were not raised in the church. A quote from chapter 3 says, "Our education has been modeled by no religious standard. We were left to the guidance of our own understanding and the casual impressions which society makes upon us. Our devotion was a mixed and casual sentiment, seldom verbally expressed or solicitously sought or carefully retained." So this was explaining that people merely talked about it, they did not live their life by it, and it was more of a casual thing. And then it goes on to discuss religion versus fanaticism, and how it can be dangerous when taken too far. It's a shift from being punished by God to being punished by the judge of the law, and being a good citizen and American versus being a good Christian. In the book, it also brings in an introduction to psychology itself, where it spends most of the book causing the reader to question if the phenomena are in fact supernatural or if Claire is insane. Brown writes it very well so that even we don't know what's going on and we're questioning whether Claire is insane or if she also is seeing things supernaturally. And I think that's a little bit of a satirical comment on religious fanaticism at the time. How did the U.S. emergence as an independent nation play in Brown's work? So we see more moving into the judgment of the law versus from God, as I talked about in the last slide. We see that in the trial in chapter 19, where he says, "It's strange, I am known to my judges and my auditors," saying that he was no longer judged by God and the church, but by the people he knew around him in society, and that they had the freedom of religion and didn't have to practice Catholicism or Christianity. At the time, the Quasi-War, the French War, was going on. It shows tension in politics and government within the book. However, they are in a higher social class, so they did not experience the tension directly. It's from afar. And then she even goes on to say, "Revolutions and battles, however calamitous to those who occupied the scene, contributed to some sort of our happiness, by agitating our minds with curiosity and furnishing causes of patriotic exultation." So they didn't even get affected by the war. If anything, it was just something for them to talk about, but they did see the suffering happening around them.
So essentially what epistolary means is that a novel was written in the form of letters or other documents such as a manuscript. Wieland is written in epistolary format. The story is told through a series of letters or epistles written by Clara Wieland to an unnamed correspondent. Why did Charles Brockden Brown choose this format for his novel? Well, the epistolary format was popular in the 18th and early 19th centuries. At this time, letter writing was regarded as a means of entertainment for the educated classes. Unlike first-person point of view, where the narrator speaks to an anonymous reader, the writer of an epistolary narrative is speaking to someone in particular, from whom the narrator might have some aspect of the story to withhold. For example, in Clara's letters to the unnamed correspondent, she would want to hide any affection she feels for Carwin. However, she writes more freely in her journal because she expects no one else to be privy to her innermost thoughts. The epistolary format allows the reader some opportunity to read between the lines, so to speak. Other notable Gothic novels written in epistolary form include Dracula by Bram Stoker and Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson.
The context of the book Wieland, just for background, it was based off of a real case that happened in 1781. A farmer upstate New York named James Yates murdered his entire family while suffering from a supposed religious delusion. 15 years later, in 1796, the New York Weekly Magazine published an anonymously written account of this occurrence, which in turn inspired Wieland. The book also talks a lot about the role of women, which relates back to Anne Bradstreet's publishings, as well as other Puritan authors, explaining even the weakness of women and how one should be modeled as a perfect woman of society, be a good wife and a good mother. It talks a lot about social classes. That relates a little bit back to Crevecoeur's What is an American, where he highlights the importance of social classes and how they do good to society. It explains in the book that the nobility of his birth was put in the balance against his poverty. So they do talk a lot about social classes and even how they weren't affected by the war. The role of religion. It shows shifting from church to state, much like in Franklin's autobiography versus Winthrop's model of Christianity, where they're moving more towards logic and reason and away from the model of the church and how you're supposed to live as a Christian. And even in the upbringing, they're showing more of education versus religious background. As for the role of the government, we see it again in the Chapter 19 trial, and it relates back to Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, where they're starting to become their own government and set their own laws and rules.
Supernatural aspects of Wieland. In the beginning of the novel, there's an unexplainable, mysterious bright light in the temple. Her eyes were fixed upon a rock. Suddenly it was illuminated. Blazing light. Had brightness of flame, but was without its upward motion. What started this bright light? What significance is it that this light was in the temple? And finally, were all these mysterious voices caused by Carwin? Were they all his doing? Thank you.